The Forbidden Experiment. In the heart of a small village stood an ancient church, its stone walls weathered by time, and its bell tower a silent witness to the passing years. Father Matthias, the young priest of this quiet town, had always been known for his curiosity. While most of the villagers were content with their simple lives, Matthias had a hunger for knowledge that could not be satisfied by prayer alone. He spent countless hours in the church's library, reading books on philosophy, science, and even the forbidden arts. He was fascinated by the mysteries of the human mind, the very thing that made people who they were. One day, while searching through a dusty old shelf in the library, Matthias found something that caught his eye. It was a thick, weathered book bound in black leather. The pages were yellowed, and the writing was ancient, barely legible in some parts. The book was titled The Mind's Eye, Unlocking the Power of Thought. The priest's heart raced as he opened the first page. What he read shocked him. It described an ancient device, one capable of reading and even controlling the thoughts of others. The idea was both horrifying and fascinating to him. He had heard rumors of such devices, but he never thought they were real. The book detailed the history of the device, which had been used by ancient civilizations to rule with an iron fist. It was said that the device could tap into the deepest recesses of the human mind, revealing every secret, every desire, every fear. But it came with a warning. The mind is not a place for man to tread. Those who seek to peer too deeply will lose themselves. Father Matthias was drawn to the idea of understanding the human mind. As a priest, he believed that knowing the thoughts of others could help him guide them, understand their sins, and bring them closer to salvation. The device, however, seemed more than just a tool for spiritual guidance. It was a weapon. The book spoke of the device's creators, a secret order of scholars and mystics who had once ruled powerful empires. They had vanished, leaving behind only whispers of their dark work. Matthias couldn't resist. The temptation was too great. He believed that if he could unlock the device's power, he could understand the minds of his people better than anyone else. He could see their deepest fears, their secret struggles, and help them in ways no one else could. He would be a true servant of God, guiding his flock with perfect knowledge. He had always prided himself on being a man of faith, but in his heart, he craved more than just the teachings of the scriptures. He craved knowledge, knowledge that could give him control over the most powerful thing in existence, the human mind. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Matthias made his decision. He gathered the materials described in the book, a small ornate device with wires and strange symbols etched into its surface. The instructions were clear. The device needed to be connected to a willing subject, someone whose mind could be unlocked. The device would then send signals that could be interpreted by the user, allowing them to read the subject's thoughts. He chose the first person he would test the device on, Sister Agnes, an elderly nun who had lived in the village her whole life. She was a kind woman, always helping others and offering prayers. Father Matthias had come to know her well over the years, and he trusted her. She was, in his mind, the perfect candidate, someone whose thoughts would be pure and easy to understand. As Sister Agnes sat in the small, dimly lit room of the church, Matthias explained the device to her. She was skeptical, but she trusted him and agreed to go along with the experiment. With trembling hands, Matthias connected the device to her temple, making sure the wires were secure. The machine hummed to life, its faint glow casting eerie shadows on the walls. At first, nothing happened. Matthias watched the device carefully, his heart pounding in his chest. Then, suddenly, he felt it. A strange, cold sensation crept through his body, as though something deep within his own mind was stirring. He looked at Sister Agnes. Her eyes were wide, staring into nothing, as though she was lost in a trance. Then, without warning, Matthias began to hear her thoughts. They were clear, as though she were speaking directly into his mind. Her thoughts were simple at first, concerns about her health, a prayer for her loved ones. But then something changed. The thoughts grew darker, more disturbing. Matthias could hear the fear in her mind, the deep, hidden secrets she had kept buried for years. It was as if the device was pulling her most private thoughts to the surface, forcing them into his consciousness. For a moment, Matthias hesitated. This was not what he had expected. He had wanted to understand, to help, but now he was hearing things that no one should ever know. It was too much. He could feel his own thoughts becoming jumbled, as though the device was slowly intertwining his mind with Sister Agnes. It was as though her fears and anxieties were becoming his. But Matthias didn't stop. He wanted more. He wanted to know everything. He pushed the device further, delving deeper into Sister Agnes's mind. The deeper he went, the more chaotic the thoughts became. And then, in the midst of the madness, he heard something terrifying. Whispers. Faint at first, they were barely audible, but as the seconds ticked by, the whispers grew louder. They were not coming from Sister Agnes's mind. They were coming from somewhere else. In a panic, Matthias tried to disconnect the device, but it wouldn't budge. The machine was alive, as though it had a mind of its own. The whispers grew louder still, now accompanied by low guttural sounds, like something ancient, something dark and evil. Father Matthias's heart raced. He had made a grave mistake. The device was not just a tool. It was a doorway, a gateway to something far worse than he could ever imagine. And now, it was too late to turn back. Suspense hook. The whispers grew into screams, and Father Matthias realized with horror that the device had connected not only to Sister Agnes, but to something far more dangerous, a force that he could never have imagined. The first mind. Father Matthias's hands trembled as he tried to disconnect the device from Sister Agnes. The whispers, which had once been faint and distant, now felt like they were tearing through his own mind. The voice was growing louder, more insistent, and more unsettling. It was as though the very air around him had thickened with the pressure of countless unseen thoughts. The priest's heart pounded in his chest as he glanced nervously at the ancient device. Sister Agnes, still in a trance, sat motionless, her eyes fixed in an unblinking stare. But something in her expression had changed. She was no longer the same gentle soul he had known. Her face had twisted, her features slack and unnerving. The fear he had initially felt grew into a deep primal panic. His own mind began to blur, and for a fleeting moment, he could not distinguish where his thoughts ended and hers began. "Father, Father, please." Sister Agnes's voice cracked, startling him. The whispering ceased, leaving an eerie silence hanging between them. Her lips trembled as though she were trying to speak, but no sound came out. He leaned closer, trying to reassure her. "It's all right, Agnes. I'm going to fix this." But she didn't respond. Instead, she began to whisper in a voice that was not her own, low, guttural words that seemed to echo through the room. Matthias's stomach churned as he realized that the words were not in any language he had ever heard before. They were ancient, filled with malice and sorrow, as though they had been buried in the earth for centuries. He could feel the darkness surrounding them, crawling beneath the surface of his consciousness. Suddenly, Sister Agnes gasped. Her body convulsed, her hands clutching the armrest of the chair, as though she were trying to pull herself free of some invisible force. "Stop, please," Matthias shouted, panicking. His hand hovered over the device, but he couldn't bring himself to touch it again. The room seemed to spin, the walls closing in on him, as though the very fabric of reality was being torn apart. The whispers grew louder, now filling his ears like an overwhelming wave. He could hear them clearly now. And they were not just coming from Sister Agnes. They were coming from something otherworldly. Sister Agnes's voice returned, but this time it wasn't her own. "You have unleashed it," the voice hissed. "You should have left it buried." Matthias stumbled backward, his eyes wide in disbelief. Who are you?" he gasped, his voice trembling. The voice from Sister Agnes's lips chuckled darkly. "We are the ones who have watched, the ones who have waited." Matthias's hands shook as he rushed to pull the device off Agnes, but no matter how hard he tried, it wouldn't come off. It seemed to be stuck, as if it had fused with her, locked in place. His mind raced as panic set in. He could hear the faint echo of voices, others calling out to him from the depths of the device, urging him to stop. The whispers began to grow even more frantic. The room seemed to warp and distort, the air thickening with each passing second. His heart felt as though it was about to burst from his chest. Sweat poured down his forehead. The device had a grip on them, and it wasn't going to let go. Sister Agnes's body jerked violently, her mouth opening wide, as if in a silent scream. Matthias's legs weakened beneath him as he stumbled back in fear. He had made a terrible mistake, one he couldn't undo. The power of the device was beyond his understanding, and now it was too late to stop it. Suddenly, a flash of clarity pierced the fog in his mind. He had to act quickly. His mind raced through the pages of the ancient book, desperately searching for any mention of how to reverse the effects of the device. His gaze flicked back to the words written in the book's worn pages, but there was no time to read. The device was more than just a mind reader. It was a mind manipulator, and it was actively rewriting Sister Agnes's thoughts, and possibly his own. Matthias's breath quickened as his mind spun in a vortex of panic. Could it be possible? Was there a way to stop this madness? Was it truly too late? In the haze of confusion, he realized something far more chilling. The device was not just reading thoughts. It was altering them. He could feel his own thoughts slipping away, as though his mind was being gently pulled out of his body, leaving him powerless. The whispers were no longer coming from Agnes, but from within him, faint, distant voices calling out to him, urging him to listen. The last thing Matthias heard before everything went black was a chilling whisper. "Now, you will know our truth." Suspense hook. Matthias's body crumpled to the floor, unconscious. As the world around him faded to black, the whispers echoed in his mind, and he realized with horror that he was no longer in control of his own thoughts. Something had taken hold of him, something far more dangerous than anything he could have imagined. The descent. When Father Matthias awoke, he was no longer in the church. His mind felt fragmented, as if it were broken into 1,000 pieces, each thought a separate, untouchable shard. His body ached, but there was something far worse. The eerie silence that filled the air was unbearable, suffocating, pressing against his chest like an unseen weight. He sat up quickly, his hands trembling as he searched for any sign of Sister Agnes or the device. The room around him was dark, unfamiliar. The walls seemed to close in as he tried to orient himself, but his thoughts wouldn't align. They slipped away, disappearing into the shadows, leaving him grasping at nothing. It was as though his mind had been replaced with someone else's, a constant war between his own identity and the voices that now filled his head. The voices, they were still there, louder now, swirling around him like a storm of whispers. They weren't just the voices of Sister Agnes anymore, nor the distant, ancient whispers he had heard before. Now, they were his thoughts, fragmented pieces of himself and others, blending together into an incomprehensible cacophony. He could feel it in every part of him, his body, his mind, his soul. He was losing himself. He pushed himself up from the cold floor, stumbling as he tried to gather his bearings. He couldn't remember how he had gotten here, but he knew that the device had done this to him. He could still feel the cold touch of its wires against his skin, the deep, unnatural sensation of it burrowing into his thoughts. Matthias stumbled toward the door, his hand shaking violently as he reached for the handle. The moment he touched it, another flood of voices crashed into his mind, louder than before, demanding his attention. "You can never leave." He recoiled, his hand jerking back as the whispers flooded in. The voice wasn't his, nor Sister Agnes. It was something else, something old. The priest's heart pounded as he pressed his hands to his temples, trying to shut out the noise. But it was impossible. The more he tried to block it out, the louder it became, overwhelming his senses. A pulse of heat shot through his chest, and for a brief moment, Matthias's thoughts cleared. He could feel something else now. Another presence, something close, watching him. He spun around, his eyes wild with fear, but there was nothing in the room. It was just him, alone. Except, of course, for the voices. Do you feel it? The change within you? The voice whispered again, the sound slithering into his ears. The device is merging your thoughts with ours. You belong to us now. Matthias gasped, trying to hold on to his sanity, but it was slipping away, just like the thoughts he had been so desperate to control. His vision blurred, and he sank to his knees, his breath coming in ragged gasps. This wasn't just some ancient relic. It was alive. The device, the whispers, they weren't just pulling thoughts. They were controlling them. He heard a laugh, soft and chilling, echoing in his mind. The sound wasn't human, but it was familiar in a terrifying way. It was the same voice that had spoken through Sister Agnes. He could feel it growing stronger, taking root in the depths of his mind. It wasn't long before the feeling of presence grew into something more. He was no longer just hearing the whispers. Now he could see them, like shadows dancing on the edges of his vision. At first, they were just fleeting, but with each passing moment, they became clearer, more defined. Dark, distorted figures moving in the corners of his eyes, just out of reach, but always there. Matthias could no longer tell if what he saw was real or just his mind playing tricks on him. Were the figures in the room real, or were they part of the madness taking hold of him? They seemed to shift and twist, their forms indistinguishable from the shadows around him. You cannot run from what you have unleashed. The voice hissed. It seemed to come from everywhere, wrapping around his mind. You are ours now. Desperately, Matthias closed his eyes, but the whispers only grew louder. They were inside his head, moving like a tide that could not be stopped. His mind, once sharp and clear, had become a battlefield, a place where the past, the present, and the future collided in an endless war. But then, through the madness, one thought broke through the chaos. It was his own, clear and firm, like a beacon of light. The device. I must destroy it. But how? How could he destroy something that was now part of him? How could he rid himself of the device that had claimed his mind, his very soul? In that moment, Matthias made a decision. He would find a way to stop this. He had to. He could not, would not, let this continue. He had to find Sister Agnes, find the device, and destroy it before it consumed him completely. But the voices whispered in his ear, louder now, more frantic. You cannot escape us. And then, in an instant, the room went silent. The shadows in the corner disappeared, leaving only darkness behind. Matthias stood there, heart pounding, trying to gather his thoughts, but they kept slipping away from him. Suddenly, the door behind him creaked open. Matthias spun around, his breath caught in his throat. Suspense hook. The door opened to reveal nothing. No one was there, but the whispers, those terrible whispers, grew louder, as if calling him, beckoning him to step forward, to take the next step into the abyss. It was only the beginning, and the descent was far from over. The horror unfolds. Matthias stood frozen, staring at the empty doorway. The air around him felt thick, like a heavy fog that pressed against his chest, making it hard to breathe. The whispers had ceased, but a deep, unsettling feeling filled the silence. He strained his ears, hoping to hear something, anything, other than the pounding of his own heart. But there was nothing, just a vast, suffocating stillness. Then, without warning, the whispers returned, louder and clearer than ever before. The voice was unmistakable, cold and mocking, as though it was savoring every moment of his fear. Come closer, Matthias. Come closer and see what you have unleashed. The words seemed to wrap around him, pulling at his very soul. He took a hesitant step forward, driven by a mix of fear and desperate curiosity. As he approached the doorway, the shadows within the room shifted. They seemed to move on their own, stretching and swirling like living things, as if they were waiting for him to enter. He stepped through the door and into the darkness. The moment he crossed the threshold, his vision blurred. The walls around him seemed to stretch and distort, as if the very fabric of reality was warping before his eyes. The floor beneath his feet shifted, becoming uneven, and he stumbled. He could feel something watching him, something inside him. And for the first time since he'd activated the device, Matthias felt truly alone. He was cut off from the world, trapped in a place where time and space had no meaning. The oppressive silence filled the room, but the whispers, they were louder now, coming from every direction. He could no longer separate his thoughts from the voices. They were one and the same. "Do you see it now?" The voice hissed, sounding both triumphant and menacing. "This is your mind. It is our mind now." Matthias's head throbbed as he tried to block out the voice. He pressed his hands to his temples, but it didn't help. The images started to invade his thoughts, visions of violence, death, and despair. They weren't his memories, but they felt so real. He saw images of war, of cities burning, of people screaming. But these weren't just images. They were feelings too, emotions that twisted and suffocated him, dragging him down into a pit of hopelessness. In a flash, Matthias realized what was happening. The device wasn't just reading his thoughts. It was showing him the darkest parts of the minds it had connected with. These weren't just the thoughts of the villagers or Sister Agnes. These were the thoughts of countless minds, twisted and corrupted over centuries by the ancient order that had created the device. The device had unlocked something far more sinister than Matthias had ever imagined. It had opened a door to something ancient, something far beyond his comprehension. Suddenly, the walls around him cracked open like an egg, revealing a vast, endless void. Matthias's breath caught in his throat. The space around him was not a room, but an abyss, a place where thoughts and memories collided in chaotic spirals. He felt his feet give way beneath him, and he was falling, tumbling into the blackness. "No, please, no," Matthias gasped, trying to regain control, but his mind was being pulled into the void, overwhelmed by the flood of images, voices, and emotions. His thoughts were no longer his own. As he fell deeper into the abyss, Matthias saw the figure of Sister Agnes appear before him. She was no longer the kind, gentle woman he had known. Her face was twisted in a grotesque expression, her eyes wide and unblinking, her mouth stretched into a silent scream. "You've opened the door." Sister Agnes's voice came not from her lips, but from every direction at once. "And now we're all trapped." Matthias reached out to her, desperate to save her, but she faded, disappearing into the void. The whispers grew louder, more frantic. The air around him thickened, and the pressure of countless thoughts crashing against his own became unbearable. He screamed, but the sound was lost in the madness, drowned by the torrent of voices. Then, in the distance, Matthias saw something that made his blood run cold. A figure, tall and cloaked in shadow, stood at the edge of the abyss, watching him with glowing eyes. It wasn't human. It was something else, something ancient and malevolent. Matthias's heart raced as he realized that this figure wasn't just a vision. It was real. The figure raised its hand, and the whispers fell silent. Matthias stood frozen, unable to move, his eyes locked on the shadowy figure. It was as though the figure's presence had pierced the very fabric of his mind, controlling him, holding him in place. "You have come far, priest." The figure spoke, its voice deep and resonant, filled with centuries of power. "But this is where your journey ends." Matthias's pulse quickened as he tried to form words, to scream, to fight, but no sound came. His mouth was dry, his body numb. The figure stepped forward, its presence growing stronger with every movement. "You are no longer the man you once were," it continued. "You are part of us now, and soon the world will know our truth." With that, the figure extended its hand toward Matthias, And in an instant, his mind was flooded with 1,000 thoughts, each one more horrifying than the last. His body convulsed, his vision spun, and for the first time, Matthias understood the true power of the device. It wasn't just a tool for reading minds. It was a tool for control, for bending the very will of those who dared to use it. And now Matthias was no longer in control of his own mind. Suspense hook. As Matthias's mind was consumed by the figure's presence, the darkness seemed to reach out and swallow him whole. The last thing he heard was a voice, not from the figure, but from somewhere deep within himself, whispering in a voice that was not his own. It's too late. The nightmare had only just begun. The truth revealed. Matthias's mind was no longer his own. The figure's hand had touched him, and the moment it did, everything changed. His thoughts were consumed by something far greater than anything he had ever encountered. The darkness surrounded him, pressing in from every side, and for a moment, he felt as though he were drowning in it. The abyss, once vast and endless, now seemed like a prison, closing in on him. The figure towered over him, its glowing eyes the only thing visible in the blackness. As Matthias tried to grasp at his thoughts, he realized something that chilled him to his core. The whispers, the voices, the chaotic flood of minds. It wasn't just an accident. It wasn't a random occurrence that had driven him mad. The device had been designed for a purpose, and that purpose had always been far darker than Matthias could have ever imagined. "We have been waiting for you," the figure said, its voice reverberating through Matthias's mind. The device was never just a tool. It was a key to a door that could never be closed again. The realization hit Matthias like a wave crashing against a rock. The device was not just a relic of some forgotten civilization. It was something much older, something that had been created by an ancient, malevolent force, a force that had been watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. He tried to fight the voices, tried to break free from the overwhelming flood of thoughts. But no matter how hard he tried, his mind only grew more tangled, more entwined with the dark presence that now controlled him. "You understand now, don't you?" The figure's voice was almost comforting, like a cold whisper from the depths of his soul. "We are not just part of you, Matthias. We are in you, and you are in us." Matthias's body trembled, his hands shaking uncontrollably. He had thought he could control the device. He had thought that by unlocking the minds of others, he could understand them, help them, guide them. But the device had never been about understanding. It had been about control, the control of minds, the manipulation of thoughts, the bending of wills. And now Matthias was just another puppet, caught in the strings of something far more powerful than himself. As the figure's words seeped into his mind, he began to see the full extent of the horror he had unleashed. The device wasn't just connected to him. It was connected to every mind it had ever touched. Every mind it had read, every thought it had unlocked, was now part of something much larger. The voices, the whispers, they were not just the thoughts of people. They were the thoughts of an ancient order, a secret society that had used the device for centuries to control the world from the shadows. The figure's eyes gleamed with malevolent triumph. "This is the truth," it said. "The device was created to conquer, to bend humanity to its will. And now, you will be the one to lead them into the next age." Matthias's stomach churned. He understood now. The ancient order had used the device to manipulate leaders, to shape civilizations, to create wars and chaos, all to ensure their domination over the world. And now the device had found its way to him. He had unknowingly become the latest vessel for their power. The whispers in his mind grew louder, more frantic. He could feel the collective thoughts of countless minds, some ancient, some recent, filling his consciousness. They were not his thoughts, but they were becoming part of him. He could hear them all, calling out to him, urging him to take control, to use the device's power to bring about a new world. "We are the many," the voice of the figure echoed in his mind. "And you are the one who will lead us. The world is waiting, Matthias. All you need to do is claim it. Matthias's heart raced, his mind a chaotic storm of conflicting thoughts. He could feel the darkness wrapping around him, suffocating him, pulling him deeper into its grasp. But through the haze of the voices, a small, flickering thought broke through. It was faint, like a dying ember, but it was there. "No," Matthias whispered to himself. "I will not be part of this." The figure laughed, the sound echoing like 1,000 hollow voices in his mind. "You cannot resist," it said. "It is already too late. You are already one of us." But Matthias refused to give in. Through the chaos, through the overwhelming pressure of the ancient minds trying to consume him, he pushed back. His will, however faint, still remained. He was a priest, a man of faith, and despite the darkness closing in, he still held on to one last truth. He was human. And humans, as flawed as they were, had something that could not be taken away: free will. With every ounce of strength he had left, Matthias fought. He focused on that single flicker of resistance, pushing back against the overwhelming tide of voices. He could feel the device pulsing in his mind, its cold presence pushing at the edges of his consciousness, but he would not let it take him completely. Not yet. He still had one chance. In a final desperate act, Matthias reached deep within himself, trying to break the link to the device, to sever the connection to the ancient power that had claimed him. And as he did, he felt something shift. Something was weakening, unraveling. But just as hope began to spark, the voice of the figure rang out again, this time colder, more menacing. "You cannot stop what has already begun," it whispered, sending a shiver down Matthias's spine. "You are ours, and the world will fall with you." Suspense hook. Matthias felt the darkness closing in once again, but something was different. The power he had tried to sever wasn't gone. It was growing stronger, and he realized, with a sickening jolt, that his fight had only just begun. The truth had been revealed, but it was far worse than he could ever have imagined. A desperate plea. Matthias could feel it now, the weight of the darkness pressing down on him, growing stronger by the second. The device was no longer just a tool. It was a parasite, wrapped tightly around his mind, feeding off his thoughts, his fears, his very essence. It wasn't just reading his mind anymore. It was shaping it, bending it, making him part of something far larger, far more ancient. The whispers, the voices, had become an inescapable tide. They filled every corner of his consciousness, twisting his thoughts and drowning out his own sense of self. The presence of the shadowy figure loomed in the edges of his perception, watching, waiting. The ancient force behind the device had claimed him, and with it, his humanity. But through the overwhelming flood of thoughts, a small part of him, the part that was still Matthias, fought. The ember of resistance that had once burned so brightly in his chest flickered weakly in the dark. It was nearly snuffed out, suffocated by the power of the ancient entity, but Matthias refused to let go. He had to hold on. He had to fight. He remembered the book, the ancient tome that had led him to this point. There had to be something in it, some way to reverse the damage, to shut down the device. But no matter how hard he tried, his mind couldn't focus. The device was interfering, pulling at every thought, erasing his ability to concentrate. Every time he reached for the answers, the whispers flooded his mind, twisting the words on the pages, confusing him. It was as though the device was actively rewriting his memory, erasing the knowledge that might save him. "You cannot escape." The voice of the figure echoed in his mind. "We are one. You will never be free of us. You will never escape what you have begun." Matthias could feel the grip tightening, but the thought of Sister Agnes, the woman who had unknowingly suffered alongside him, pierced through the chaos. What had happened to her? What had become of the people in the village? Were they all trapped like him, lost in the darkness of the device's power? Desperation surged through him, and with it, a new sense of clarity. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way out, but it required one thing above all: sacrifice. He had to break the connection, sever the device's hold on him, even if it meant losing everything. The thought of destroying the device terrified him, but the alternative, allowing it to consume more innocent lives, was far worse. He couldn't allow that. Matthias closed his eyes, taking a deep breath, ignoring the screams of the countless voices filling his mind. They were not his. They were not real. He had to remember who he was. He was a man, a priest, someone with a purpose. This wasn't him. He couldn't let the device define his fate. With his will faltering, Matthias reached inward, searching for the place where his mind had once been whole. He had to find the strength to disconnect. The voices screamed louder, pushing against his thoughts, drowning him in their unholy chorus. But through the haze, Matthias heard a sound, his own voice. It was faint, barely a whisper, but it was there, buried beneath the sea of noise. "I am Matthias," he muttered to himself, his voice shaky but growing stronger. "I am human. I can fight this." With trembling hands, he reached for the ancient device embedded in his mind. The source of the torment. It pulsed with cold energy, its presence so overwhelming it made his skin crawl. His fingers brushed against the edges of the device, but instead of pulling away in fear, Matthias pushed further, reaching for the control that had eluded him for so long. The device fought back, sending jolts of pain through his body, trying to force him back into the abyss. It whispered promises, promises of power, of control. But Matthias fought harder, pushing against the darkness with all his remaining strength. "You will never be free," the voice of the figure hissed. "You are ours, forever." But Matthias knew that it was lying. The voices were not his own. They had no power over him. They were nothing more than shadows. He was not a tool for their manipulation. His hand found something. A thread, a glimmer of light in the darkness. With one final surge of strength, Matthias yanked at the thread, pulling it free from the abyss that had held him captive. The device trembled, its power surging, fighting against him, but Matthias held fast. Suspense hook. As Matthias wrenched the device free from the depths of his mind, a terrifying realization dawned on him. Destroying the device would not be enough. The darkness had already spread. There was no going back. The battle was far from over, and the world would soon learn that the nightmare had only just begun. Matthias's grip tightened, his mind reeling with the consequences of his actions. The voices screamed louder, now frantic, desperate to pull him back into their control. But Matthias had made his choice. He had to finish what he had started, even if it meant risking everything. The endless scream. The world around Matthias collapsed in on itself, the darkness pressing tighter and tighter, until he couldn't tell where his body ended and the void began. The device pulsed violently in his mind, like the beating of a cold heart, each throb sending waves of pain through his body. But despite the agony, Matthias held on to his resolve. He had freed himself from its immediate control, but the battle was far from over. The whispers had not stopped. In fact, they had grown louder, more frantic, as though the ancient presence was now desperately trying to pull him back. The voice of the figure still echoed in his head, now tinged with rage. "You cannot escape what you have become," the figure snarled. "You will scream, Matthias. You will scream until you wish for death itself." Matthias clenched his teeth against the overwhelming pressure in his mind. He had torn the connection, but he could still feel it. The cold touch of the device's influence lingering, twisting his thoughts, trying to pull him back into the abyss. But no matter how loud the whispers grew, no matter how much the darkness threatened to swallow him whole, he fought. He had to fight, not just for himself, but for the world that was still out there, unaware of the nightmare that was unfolding. He staggered to his feet, feeling the weight of 1,000 thoughts pressing against him, his mind a battlefield. The darkness around him had no end. It stretched on, a void that had no place for a human soul. But Matthias had come to understand one thing. The device had not just unlocked minds. It had unlocked the depths of human consciousness, the good, the evil, the unimaginable horror, and the unyielding light. And in that moment, Matthias realized something else. The device wasn't just about control. It was about breaking the boundary between the conscious and the unconscious, between the living and the dead. It had opened a door that should have remained sealed forever. But the most terrifying truth of all was that the door wasn't just open for him. It was open for everyone. He had tried to stop the voices, tried to stop the darkness, but he now understood that there was no real escape. The device had already begun to leak its poison into the world, and soon others would hear the whispers too. It had already begun to spread, and soon there would be no one untouched by its call. It would consume everyone, just as it had consumed him. As Matthias fell to his knees, the full weight of his failure crushed him. The voices grew louder, until they were all he could hear, all he could feel. He screamed, not out of pain, but out of an overwhelming sense of hopelessness. He had tried to fight, tried to undo the damage, but now it seemed as though it was already too late. The device had connected him to something far darker than he could have imagined, a force that had existed long before humanity, and one that would continue to thrive long after. The endless scream that escaped his lips was not just his own. It was the scream of every mind the device had touched. It was the collective agony of 1,000 souls trapped in a cycle of torment and madness, and it would continue, growing louder, spreading faster, until there was no one left who hadn't heard the call. Suspense hook. As Matthias's body trembled and the darkness closed in around him, a final thought flashed through his mind. This is just the beginning. And in that moment, he understood that the device had not only opened a door, it had opened a gateway. And soon, it would call to those who had been waiting on the other side. The nightmare had only just begun. The world would never be the same.